Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. The pub is seen as one of those very British of institutions, an integral part of the fabric of every community. And many say pubs, which provide a meeting point for people, a focal point for the community, and even a repository of a place's history, are in terminal decline. More than half of the villages in the UK no longer have a pub at all, and while figures vary, it's said that between 30 and 50 pubs are closing in Britain every week. Those lobbying to preserve the pub are calling for more urgent action from the government. But last week, hopes were dashed that a controversial annual rise in beer duty would be reviewed in the Chancellor's autumn statement. It's prompted criticism that the government has missed out on an opportunity to create 5,000 jobs this year, and it could have gone some way in stemming the decline. The so-called beer duty escalator automatically increases taxes by 2% above inflation every year and is blamed for accelerating the decline of community pubs. Some say government policy focusing on tackling excessive and binge drinking is to the detriment of preserving pubs, which in many urban parts of the country are being overtaken by chains and people preferring to drink at home. What's the future of the pub industry? Are the drinking habits of Britons changing? And are we heading towards a future of chain pubs or pubcos? Or is it too late to save the local village pub? Well, to discuss this and more, I'm joined by Neil Williams. He's the Communications Manager from the British Beer and Pub Association. David Smith, who's Economics Editor of the Sunday Times. And Dr. James Nichols, who's Research Manager at Alcohol Research UK and author of a book called The Politics of Alcohol, A History of the Drink Question in England. Thank you very much for joining me here today on The Voice of Russia, gentlemen. First of all, the duty escalator, it wasn't rescinded, it wasn't even considered. What was your reaction to that, Neil?
Well, as you say, it's very, very disappointing. We had a large group of MPs in Parliament calling for a review as soon as possible of the beer duty escalator, and that hasn't happened. Since 2008, in March, we have seen the duty increase on beer of 42%, which is a totally unsustainable level, and that hits pubs particularly hard because beer still remains the drink of the pub. It's also very bad for employment and jobs because it's a more labour-intensive industry because it's served in pubs. It has a knock-on effect in terms of job creation, and that's why I think you mentioned 5,000 jobs every year are dependent on the beer duty escalator not being implemented. So very, very disappointing, but we won't give up. We will keep making the case for a freeze in beer duty in the budget.
David Smith, did it come as any surprise to you? I mean, we had the freeze on duty for petrol, for instance. Beer, a slightly different thing, but it could have gone some way in boosting British business, a very British business, in fact.
Yes, and if you're looking for positive headlines in the tabloid newspapers, freezing fuel duty was one thing. A cut or a promised cut or a freeze on beer duty would also have generated some positive headlines. I think the difference between the two is that the fuel duty one was obviously seen as a higher priority. If anything, the impetus for freezing that was stronger than the freeze than doing something on beer duty. But it is a problem. It's a huge problem for the pub industry. And what's happened over the past 5 years is a change of stance. Before that, governments seemed quite responsive to the idea that by increasing duty on alcohol and particularly on beer, you were pricing pubs out of the market. You were making it easier for people to get beer on the Calais run from France and so on. But there has been a shift now. They've obviously decided that you can push this. I suspect they are pushing it a bit too much in terms of the increase in duty.
It was brought in under the Labour administration, and I mean, from your perspective, James Nichols, it seems to be working because it is actually impacting on the way people drink, the way they consume alcohol.
Well, I think that was one of the stated reasons why it was introduced. And I think one of the problems that the government faces at the moment is that while there are still concerns over issues around public drinking and public disorder, the beer duty escalator is a difficult one to cut in that context, even given the counterclaims that it's targeting British business. Under the Labour government, I think what happened was that at the time that it was introduced, there was widespread concern, particularly about public drinking, and I think there was a sense that the pub or the bar, particularly high street bars in city centres, were places that needed to be tackled, and the beer duty escalator seemed to be one of those ways of saying that the government was doing something to target pricing and to target cheap alcohol. The question is whether beer was ever really the root of that problem, or whether other kinds of drinks were the ones that were more associated with the problem drinking that we're seeing on our streets. And secondly, I think has already been alluded to, whether it was drinking in pubs that was the problem, or whether it was drinking at home, particularly drinking at home prior to going out, that was causing some of those very visible problems that were appearing in the media.
Well, Neil Williams, it seems that there's more factors other than the beer duty escalator, though, isn't it? I mean, and from your organisation's perspective, just how in danger is the British pub?
Well, you're right to say that there are other factors at work. We've certainly, in the hospitality industry, it suffers very badly during an economic downturn, and we've seen that. We've got long-term trends at work as well. We've got people switching to wine. But given that we want to encourage social drinking in pubs, particularly of a drink that is actually the lowest strength category in general, beer typically between 4 and 5% in terms of alcohol strength, we do think the government shouldn't be loading this extra burden on us with these huge tax increases. You know, it's a time to give a helping hand to pubs to ensure that they can compete effectively with supermarkets and encourage people to go out, drink socially, create jobs. And that's why we think the government should look again at the whole policy.
How many pubs are closing per week? There is some discrepancy over whether or not pubs are simply changing use. They're moving more towards eating premises. They're not necessarily wet-led premises. I mean, what's your take on that? How many?
Well, the current picture, I think, is that the closure rate is slightly less than that at the moment. I think it's about 18 per week, according to the very latest figures. But that, of course, is still a big blow. If you lose your pub, you've lost a community hub. And if you can't go out and walk to the nearest venue to enjoy a social drink, I think it's something about local life that's being lost. So while the rate isn't as high as you suggest, it's still a major problem. We don't want to lose more pubs. You alluded to the fact that pubs are now selling more food, and that's true, and that's a good thing. I mean, pubs sell more food than all of the restaurants in Britain now put together. That's been another huge change, and it shows that pubs can adapt and change. And, we think pubs are the place of social drinking, increasingly with food, and therefore it's something the government should be encouraging.
And how important are they to a community? I mean, I suppose we're here in the centre of London, but I mean, if you're in a small village in Shropshire, for instance, it's more of a focal point for the community, isn't it? Are these the ones that your organisation is most concerned about?
Yes, I think that's right. I think there's quite a lot of evidence that town centre venues are very resilient, especially in London with its very resilient economy. But certainly in more rural areas where pubs really do focus as a community hub. And in many places, they'll be the only community hub. You see village shops closing, village schools closing, you see village post offices closing. So the hub is often the key social network that's left remaining. And there's definitely something very special lost in local life if that pub disappears.
James Nichols from Alcohol Research UK, the idea of fewer people going to the pub, is this meaning just a shift in drinking habits?
If you look over the longer term, that's certainly been the trend. There's been a trend towards more drinking at home, towards more wine consumption, towards more wine consumption in the off-trade. There's a long-term historical move away from alcohol consumption taking place in the pub as the primary location for drinking. That's a long-term trend. I think that now, when you see increasing reductions in pub numbers, that doesn't necessarily mean that people are drinking less because there's so much drinking going on at home. And it also doesn't mean that people are necessarily drinking more in pubs because there is this issue of people going out later because pubs, especially town centre pubs, are tending to open later and close later. People drinking before they go out. The actual volume of alcohol consumed, if you look at it in units terms in particular, as opposed to the pure the number of pints, isn't a reflection of how many people are necessarily in pubs or what time or how long they're spending in pubs, because people can have drunk a fair amount before they get there.
But Britons are drinking less than the EU average, aren't they? They're drinking less than they did 20 years ago. Would that be fair to say?
Britain's overall consumption has never been at the top of the table. This is one of those things that people tend to a misconception about British drinking. In terms of overall consumption, our levels have tended to be relatively mid-table in terms of European averages. Where we come near the top of the table is what you'd call binge drinking, or drinking large amounts in concentrated periods. We generally come towards the top of the table in terms of that. As far as overall consumption goes and the trends in recent years, the overall trends have been moving downwards since about the mid-2000s. But the thing to bear in mind is that the peak they hit in the mid-2000s was dramatically high, historically speaking. There had been an increase from the late 60s onwards. So there's a trend, a move in the right direction. I think what we need to know more about is who is drinking less, and whether it's a universal downward trend or whether it's a trend that's located in particular groups of drinkers who are drinking considerably less while other drinkers are drinking the same amount. We just don't know enough about who's drinking what to be able to talk about that.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing the future of the British pub with Neil Williams, David Smith and James Nichols. And in terms of tackling this so-called scourge of binge drinking, I guess, government policy is concentrated on what we've had recently with minimum alcohol pricing. Does that feed in any way to pub attendance and people going to the pub as well? And should this really not be considered, this should be considered separately as a separate part of government policy?
Well, I think there are different ways of looking at minimum unit pricing. If you look at the government's alcohol strategy, it's presented as a way of tackling antisocial behaviour. I think a lot of the modelling around minimum unit pricing talks about its effect on overall consumption and it being an intervention to prevent long-term health harms, in fact. So there's a question about, particularly with young people, the extent to which minimum unit pricing will target them as opposed to more harmful drinkers who drink more overall. The thing about young drinkers is they don't necessarily drink more than other drinkers. In fact, they tend to drink, as far as we know, slightly less than people in their 40s. It's that they drink a lot when they go out. Minimum unit pricing, where it may target that is that if it makes the cheap alcohol that people buy in supermarkets before they go out slightly more expensive, it may reduce consumption there. But in terms of its impact on pub attendance, I think the reason that a number of brewers or a number of the people in the pub trade support minimum pricing is that they're hoping that it will encourage people to drink in pubs more often because it will level the playing field. But we don't know for certain whether that would be the case. But that's certainly one of the effects that I think people are hoping for.
David Smith from the Sunday Times, it seems like government legislation is working, isn't it? Because not with minimum pricing, but the beer duty escalator, it's curbing drinking to a certain extent. But it's almost like the government isn't particularly interested in the British pub as maintaining it as an institution. It's really focused on curbing the amount of alcohol people are drinking.
I think to an extent that is true, although it's, there are many other things wrapped in there. For obvious example, we've the period since which the duty escalator has been in place has been a very difficult period for consumers. Consumer spending has never been as depressed at this stage of an economic cycle as it is at the moment. We haven't had a recovery in consumer spending. It's still below 2008 levels. So you have to wrap it all in that. I mean, in some respects, the resilience of the pub is quite impressive. I mean, obviously it's very sad when you hear of pub closures, particularly when they are integral to community life. But if you think of the way that, the pub culture developed, it was an era where, lots and lots of people were engaged in manual work. And pubs, particularly city pubs in industrial cities, they were there so that people who've been, expending lots of energy and sweat in manual work could replace the fluid they'd lost with generally low-strength beer. The beer in the industrial north was relatively low strength. And 8 or 10 pints of beer it didn't have to be beer, but 8 or 10 pints of liquid was there to replace the what you'd lost during your shift in the steelworks or down the coal mine or whatever. Now, the fact that people still drink what you might call industrial quantities of beer, even though they're not doing industrial work, is quite impressive. But in terms of the culture, the survival of pubs have had to take a lot of things. For country pubs, tougher drink driving laws have obviously been a factor. The fact that, even whatever happens to the duty, it is still the case that if I buy a pint of beer in the pub, for the same amount of money, I could buy 4 cans in the supermarket. So the relative pricing is a problem and is going to remain a problem. Neil will know what the impact of the ban on smoking in public places has been, whether it's been positive or negative for pubs. But that's another factor the pub industry has had to deal with. But I think it's we shouldn't be too pessimistic about pubs. I mean, I think there is still a lot of resilience there, and there are some pubs which, as you will all know around this table, you can't get into during busy times. They do incredibly well. Whatever their offering is, it works, and some bits of the industry are incredibly successful.
There has been wholesale changes in the industry in the last few years, and David alludes to the smoking ban. Has that meant that fewer people go to the pub, or has it actually encouraged people who wouldn't otherwise go to a smoky pub to go, or has it been a balance? There's been no change at all?
Well, it's been a bit of both, but of course it's hit different types of pubs in different ways. I think overall there was a shock in which 5 to 10% of trade was lost overnight, and of course it hit particularly what we call wet-led pubs, those that were really reliant on alcohol sales, particularly hard. Food-led pubs might have had a boost from it. I think there's a bit of evidence out there to suggest that. So it's hit different parts of the trade in different ways, but overall it certainly did have a downward effect on the total turnover of the sector, as we said it would. But, pubs are fighting back, as you rightly say. Food is a much bigger offering. Also, pubs are installing great state-of-the-art coffee machines in order to compete with what is now a burgeoning coffee trade in the high street, and all sorts of other ways, installing internet access and so on. Pubs are fighting back, and as you rightly say, you get new openings as well as closures. It's not all about closures, it's about investment, new openings and new opportunities as well.
So the complaints and the criticisms of the demise of the British pub, is that really taking into account the fact that pubs need to change with the times and look for other revenue streams, become cafes, become those places that people can hang out during the day? They have Wi-Fi, they might have the football on or whatever. I mean, that pubs aren't changing with the times in the way that they should be.
Well, I think the ones that aren't adapting and investing, and some of them are not in a position to do so, it's fair to say, are the ones that are going to struggle, sure. But you're quite right. Pubs have always adapted to the times. 30, 40 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to get a curled-up sandwich in a pub. Now, of course, there's a huge food experience out there and a huge variety of food to be enjoyed in pubs. So, yes, it is a case of adapt and survive and invest, and that's always going to be the case. You're quite right to highlight we still have 50,000 pubs. It may be well down on the 60,000 that we had 10 years ago, but still a huge part of Britain's social life and the high street and local communities.
But as David Smith mentioned, I mean, the history of the pub, and obviously, in Victorian times where the worker after a hard day's work would go and possibly mingle with people not of his own class, of a higher class. It was a real community outlet. But Britain has changed completely like that. It's very multicultural, and do you think pubs are staying modern enough? Are they keeping with the times, or should we look at them as some kind of a repository of history, a tourist attraction almost, and they need to be preserved in the way that historic buildings are preserved?
Well, I think there's certainly room for both types of pubs. You've got very, high street venues that are very modern, but certainly if you ask tourists, one of the first things they always mention is the British pub when they come. Well, as you say, it's very, very disappointing. We had a large group of MPs in Parliament calling for a review as soon as possible of the beer duty escalator, and that hasn't happened. Since 2008, in March, we have seen the duty increase on beer of 42%, which is a totally unsustainable level, and that hits pubs particularly hard because beer still remains the drink of the pub. It's also very bad for employment and jobs because it's a more labour-intensive industry, because it's
on some way in stemming the decline. The so-called beer duty escalator automatically increases taxes by 2% above inflation every year and is blamed for accelerating the decline of community pubs. Some say government policy focusing on tackling excessive and binge drinking is to the detriment of preserving pubs, which in many urban parts of the country are being overtaken by chains and people preferring to drink at home. What's the future of the pub industry? Are the drinking habits of Britons changing, and are we heading towards a future of chain pubs or pubcos? Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. The pub is seen as one of those very British of institutions, an integral part of the fabric of every community. And many say pubs, which provide a meeting point for people, a focal point for the community, and even a repository of a place's history, are in terminal decline. More than half of the villages in the UK no longer have a pub at all, and while figures vary, it's said that between 30 and 50 pubs are closing in Britain every week. Those lobbying to preserve the pub are calling for more urgent action from the government. But last week, hopes were dashed that a controversial annual rise in beer duty would be reviewed in the Chancellor's autumn statement. It's prompted criticism that the government has missed out on an opportunity to create 5,000 jobs this year, and it could have gone. Is it too late to save the local village pub? Well, to discuss this and more, I'm joined by Neil Williams. He's the communications manager from the British Beer and Pub Association, David Smith, who's economics editor of the Sunday Times, and Dr. James Nichols, who's research manager at Alcohol Research UK and author of a book called The Politics of Alcohol, A History of the Drink Question in England. Thank you very much for joining me here today on The Voice of Russia, gentlemen. First of all, the duty escalator, it wasn't rescinded, it wasn't even considered. What was your reaction to that, Neil?